The call came at 7 in the evening, and by 8, Thalia Vance was standing in a wine cellar that smelled like money and fear. She hadn't wanted to take the job. The client's assistant had refused to give a name over the phone, only a location, Chateau Bellevue, a vineyard estate outside Bordeaux, and an offer so large it made Thalia's hands shake when she read the number twice. One evening. That was all they wanted. One evening of her time, her expertise, her name on a report. She should have asked more questions. She would learn that later. The man waiting for her at the vaulted stone entrance was not what she expected. No bodyguards flanking him, no theatrical menace. Just a tall figure in a dark coat, sleeves pushed up, studying a printout like it had personally offended him. When he looked up, his eyes were calm in a way that unsettled her more than shouting would have. "You're late," he said. "You're mysterious," she replied. "I think that makes us even." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe amusement. "Kaelen Cross," he said, extending a hand. "I was told you're the best supply chain auditor in Europe. I need you to prove it tonight." Thalia had heard the name before, in the way people mention things they'd rather not say too loudly. Kaelen Cross wasn't just a wine exporter. He ran a logistics empire that moved luxury goods across 3 continents, and the whispers about how he protected that empire were the kind that made seasoned businessmen change the subject. She told herself she was here for the fee and nothing more. "Then stop wasting my evening and show me the problem," she said. He led her down into the cellar without another word. The vault was enormous, climate-controlled, lined with racks of bottles worth more than most people's homes. But the air was wrong. Thalia noticed it the moment she stepped inside, a faint sourness under the usual cellar smell of oak and stone. 3 shipments, Kaelen said, handing her a folder. "All bound for a consortium in Seoul. Contract signs in 3 days, the biggest deal of my career, and someone is destroying my wine before it even leaves French soil." Thalia pulled a bottle from the nearest rack, held it to the light, and frowned. The seal looked untouched. She checked the temperature log clipped to the shelf. Normal range, no red flags. Anyone glancing at these numbers would call it bad luck, natural spoilage, an unfortunate season. She didn't believe in unfortunate seasons. "Give me 30 minutes, she said, already pulling equipment from her bag. A portable spectrometer, a laptop, a notebook she'd filled with a decade of instincts she trusted more than any machine. Kaelen didn't argue. He simply stood back and watched her work, arms crossed, jaw tight, the posture of a man used to being obeyed rather than waiting. Thalia moved fast. She cross-referenced the digital logs against the physical thermometers bolted to the racks, a habit most auditors skipped because it was tedious and almost always pointless. Almost. Here, the numbers told 2 different stories. The digital log showed a smooth, steady 4 degrees Celsius for the entire month. The physical gauge, still holding its last reading, showed a spike to 11 degrees for exactly 40 minutes, 3 nights ago. Then a return to normal. Then the log quietly overwritten. Her pulse picked up. This wasn't decay. This was design. Someone accessed your cooling system and adjusted it just enough to compromise the wine, then erased the evidence, she said, straightening up. This isn't spoilage, Mr. Cross. This is sabotage. Deliberate, precise, and timed. The cellar went very quiet. Timed for what? He asked, though something in his voice told her he already suspected the answer. For your signing, she said. Whoever did this knew your calendar. They knew exactly how long the wine needed to sit before the floor would surface, right around the moment your buyers opened the first bottle. She looked up at him. This wasn't meant to just cost you money. It was meant to humiliate you in front of people you can't afford to lose. Kaelen's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went cold and still, like a door closing. 3 days, he said quietly, almost to himself. They picked their moment well. Who has access to override your cooling logs? Thalia asked. Because whoever did this has clearance most employees don't. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the racks, running one hand slowly along the dust on a bottle's shoulder, as if the wine itself might tell him something the logs couldn't. "That," he finally said, "is a very short list, and I don't like any of the names on it." Thalia closed her laptop, feeling the shift in the room, the moment a routine consulting job stopped being routine. She'd been hired for one evening, one report, one fee, one clean exit before midnight. Looking at Kaelen Cross's face just then, she understood, with a small, sinking certainty, that midnight was not going to save her. "Mr. Cross," she said carefully, "I think you're going to need me for longer than one evening." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he almost smiled. "Pack a bag, Ms. Vance," he said. "We're going to Rotterdam." The private jet smelled like leather and cold air conditioning, and Thalia sat across from a man who had just turned her one evening job into something with no clear end date. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't had time. Kaelen's assistant, a quiet woman named Odette, who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, had handed her a small case at the airstrip, toiletries, a change of clothes, things Thalia hadn't asked for and didn't remember mentioning she needed. It unsettled her, how prepared they were. As if Kaelen had known, the moment she found that gauge reading, that she wasn't leaving his orbit tonight. "You planned this," she said, buckling in. "Before I even confirmed the sabotage, you already had a case packed." Kaelen didn't look up from the tablet in his hands. "I plan for outcomes, Ms. Vance, not certainties. If you'd found nothing, you'd have gone home with your fee and a story about a strange rich man who wasted your evening." He finally met her eyes. "You found something, so now we deal with what's real." "And what's real is Rotterdam." "What's real," he said, turning the tablet toward her, "is this." On the screen was a schematic of a shipping route, Bordeaux to the coast, then by refrigerated freight up through France and Belgium, ending at a transit hub outside Rotterdam before the containers were loaded onto vessels bound for Asia. Kaelen tapped a red marker on the map, right at the Dutch hub. "I had my people cross-reference your finding against the shipment's physical route the moment you told me the spoilage was timed and deliberate," he said. "The temperature spike happened during a 2-hour window when the containers sat at this exact facility. Nowhere else on the route has that kind of gap in surveillance." Thalia stared at the map, doing the math in her head. "You had someone running that analysis while I was still in your cellar." "I don't like waiting for information I already suspect." "That's not confidence, Mr. Cross. That's control." She said it lightly, but she meant it as a warning, and from the way his jaw tightened, he heard it as one too. "In my business," he said, "the two aren't so different." The plane leveled out over dark countryside, and for a while neither of them spoke. Thalia watched the lights of small towns blink past far below, and thought about how quickly the night had unraveled. A routine audit, a 6-figure fee, a clean exit before midnight. And now she was thousands of feet in the air with a man whose reputation preceded him by continents. She should have been afraid. Strangely, she wasn't. Not of him. She was afraid of how easily she'd said yes to Rotterdam. "Tell me something," Kaelen said eventually, breaking the silence. "Why olives?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "Your file. Before you were an auditor, your family ran an olive grove in the Peloponnese. 3 generations. You still hold partial ownership, though the land's been under financial pressure for the last 2 years." He said it plainly, without apology for having read a file on her life before she'd even arrived at his chateau. "I'm curious why someone with your background ended up chasing spoiled wine through European supply chains instead of running the family land." Thalia's hands tightened slightly in her lap. It wasn't a subject she discussed with strangers, let alone dangerous ones. But something about the directness of his question, stripped of the usual polite circling people did around a painful topic, made her answer honestly. "Because I watched a corporation try to buy my grandfather's grove out from under him for less than 1/10 of its worth, and I couldn't stop it with love for the land," she said. "I could only stop it with knowledge of contracts, logistics, and the exact language companies use to make theft look like generosity. So I learned that language instead. I thought if I understood the system well enough, I could protect what mattered before it was too late. And did it work? For your grandfather's grove? Not entirely, Thalia admitted. We're still fighting. There's a new buyer circling again, a bigger one this time. My mother sent me a letter about it 2 weeks ago. I haven't answered it yet, because I don't have an answer that isn't, we're going to lose it eventually. Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition, as if he'd found something he understood better than he let on. "When we land in Rotterdam," he said finally, "give me the buyer's name and your family's contract." "Why?" "Because I have lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of predatory acquisition, and because you're about to spend the next several days pulling apart a sabotage plot aimed at destroying my business," he said. "I don't let people who work for me lose everything they love while they're busy saving what's mine. That's not how I operate." Thalia searched his face for the catch, the string attached, the price she'd inevitably have to pay for a favor from a man like Kaelen Cross. She didn't find one, just steady, unreadable calm. "I'm not sure I trust an offer that comes this easily," she said. "Good," he replied. "You shouldn't trust anything in my world easily, but you can trust that one." He turned back to his tablet, the conversation apparently closed, though something had shifted in the cabin, a thread pulled taut between two people who'd known each other for less than 4 hours and were already trading pieces of themselves they usually kept locked away. The jet began its descent as the lights of Rotterdam's port sprawled out beneath them, an enormous grid of cranes and containers glowing orange against the dark water like a city built entirely out of machinery. "That's the hub," Kaelen said, nodding toward the window. "Somewhere down there is the person who thinks they can burn my empire down without me noticing who lit the match." Thalia looked out at the maze of steel and light, feeling the last of her hesitation give way to something sharper, curiosity, purpose, and underneath it, a flicker of something she didn't have a name for yet. "Then let's go find them," she said, "before they realize we already know where to look." The transit hub at dawn looked nothing like the glowing grid Thalia had seen from the plane. Up close, it was cold, loud, and enormous, a maze of stacked containers 3 stories high, forklifts screaming across wet concrete, and the constant metallic groan of cranes lifting freight into the pale morning light. The air smelled of diesel and salt water, and the wind coming off the North Sea cut straight through Thalia's coat. "This way," Kaelen said, already walking ahead of her with the kind of certainty that made port workers step aside without being asked. He didn't flash credentials or raise his voice, people simply moved. "You own this facility?" Thalia asked, jogging slightly to keep pace. "I lease a section of it, enough to control access to my own containers." He gestured toward a row of refrigerated units marked with a small insignia she recognized from the folder back in Bordeaux, his private reserve shipment, the one meant to replace the compromised bottles before the Sol signing. This is where the temperature spike occurred, 2 hours, unaccounted for, 3 nights ago. They reached the container in question, and Thalia crouched down to examine the cooling unit mounted on its exterior. It looked ordinary at first, an industrial refrigeration box, humming quietly, gauges reading a steady 4 degrees. But when she ran her gloved fingers along the seam where the unit met the container wall, she felt something that shouldn't have been there. A second, smaller panel, tucked flush against the housing, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. "Kaelen," she said quietly, "come look at this." He crouched beside her, and together they pried the panel open. Inside was a compact electronic device, no bigger than a deck of cards, wired directly into the cooling unit's control board. A small light on its surface blinked once, then went dark, as if it sensed it had been found. "A bypass unit," Thalia said, turning it over carefully. "This isn't something you buy at a hardware store. Someone built this specifically to intercept the cooling system's commands, spike the temperature for a set window, then erase the log and reset everything to normal. That takes real engineering, real money." Kaelen took the device from her hands, his expression unreadable, and turned it over until he found what he was looking for. A tiny manufacturer's stamp etched into the base. easy to miss unless you knew to check. His face changed the instant he saw it. "Vanguard," he said, and the word came out low, almost bitten off. "You know the company?" "I know the company," he said. "Vanguard Logistics, one of the largest freight and cold chain technology firms in Europe. They build exactly this kind of custom hardware for high-security shipping operations." He set the device down on the container's edge with unusual care, as if it were something that might still hurt him. "And they're owned entirely by my half-sister." Thalia went still. "Your sister did this?" "Half-sister, Beatrice." He said the name the way some people said a diagnosis, clinical, resigned, already bracing for what came next. "Our father built 2 empires before he died and split them unevenly. I got the luxury goods network, she got logistics and freight technology. She has spent the better part of a decade telling anyone who'll listen that my half was the better inheritance and that she deserves both." "So this is about revenge?" "This is about acquisition," Kaelen corrected. "Beatrice doesn't want revenge. She wants my clients, my roots, my reputation, and the fastest way to get all 3 is to make me look incompetent right before the biggest deal of my career. If the Seoul Consortium believes my cold chain security is compromised, they won't just cancel the contract. They'll go looking for a more reliable partner." His eyes flicked toward the container, toward the small device that had just confirmed everything he suspected and dreaded in equal measure. And Vanguard would be more than happy to offer them one. Thalia stood, brushing the cold off her knees, and thought through the mechanics of it with the same clear focus she brought to every audit. Strip the emotion out, follow the structure. "This isn't just sabotage then, it's a business strategy. Damage your reputation just enough that you're forced into a merger to save face, and Beatrice gets everything without ever having to fight you publicly." "That's exactly what it is," Kaelen said. "And it means she has someone inside my organization, someone with access to my shipping schedules, my hub codes, my private manifest. This device didn't install itself." "Who has that kind of access?" "A very short list," he said again, echoing what he'd told her back in the chateau cellar, except now his voice carried something sharper, the particular fury of a man realizing the wound had come from somewhere close. Thalia crouched back down beside the container, examining the bypass unit more closely, running her fingers along a data port on its side. "This thing has a memory chip. If it recorded any of its own activity, timestamps, remote commands, we might be able to trace exactly who triggered it, and from where." Kaelen's expression shifted, something like grim satisfaction breaking through the anger. "Can you extract it?" "Not here. I'd need equipment and privacy, somewhere Beatrice's people can't watch us working." Thalia glanced around the busy hub, at the workers and cranes, and the constant flow of freight that made it impossible to know who might be reporting back to Vanguard at that very moment. "This place isn't safe for that kind of work." "I have a location," Kaelen said. "A safe house, 10 minutes from here. Private, secure, off any official record." He was already walking, already 3 steps ahead of her toward the parking structure, coat snapping in the cold wind. "We'll extract the data there. And Miss Vance?" She caught up to him, matching his stride. "Yes?" "Whatever we find in that memory chip," he said, his voice quieter now, almost weighed down, "I need you to tell me the truth of it, even if the trail leads somewhere I don't want it to go." Thalia thought of the folder she'd glimpsed briefly on the jet, thick with names of Kaelen's inner circle, people who'd worked for him for years, people he likely trusted the way most people trusted family. She understood then what he was really asking, not for competence, but for honesty, from a stranger he'd known less than 12 hours, because he suspected the betrayal might be close enough to hurt. "I always tell the truth of an audit," she said. "That's the only thing I sell." Kaelen almost smiled again, that same rare, brief flicker from the jet. "Good," he said, "because I think we're about to find out exactly how deep this goes." The safe house was nothing like Thalia expected from a man who ran a global empire. No marble, no glass, no obvious wealth. Just a converted dockworker's cottage on a quiet canal, thick curtains drawn, a single desk lamp casting warm light over a room that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. "Discretion over comfort," Kaelen said, catching her looking around. "The people who'd think to search a mansion would never think to search here." Thalia set up her equipment on the small wooden table, a data reader, a laptop, the bypass device's memory chip carefully extracted and cradled in a static-proof sleeve. It took nearly 40 minutes of patient work, coaxing the corrupted files back into something readable, before the screen finally populated with a string of timestamps and command logs. "Got it," she murmured, scrolling through lines of code. "Remote activation. 3 nights ago, 11:47 p.m. The command came through an encrypted relay, bounced through 2 shell servers before hitting the bypass unit directly. She frowned at the final line. The originating IP traces back to a Vanguard subsidiary account, but there's a secondary authorization code here, something that had to be entered manually, on-site, by someone with physical access to your shipping schedule. "Someone inside," Kaelen said quietly, standing behind her chair now, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him. "I can narrow the list once I cross-reference the authorization code against Vanguard's employee registry," Thalia said. "Give me your laptop. I want to pull their public corporate filings, shareholder structure, subsidiary names, anyone who might be moonlighting on both payrolls." Kaelen retrieved a second laptop from a locked case and set it in front of her, along with a small external drive. "That has copies of everything my legal team has already gathered on Vanguard over the years. Ownership records, board minutes, filed disputes. It might save you time." Thalia plugged in the drive and began searching, cross-referencing Vanguard's registered entities against the authorization code's format, looking for a pattern. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind she usually found satisfying in its precision, but 20 minutes in, she opened a folder she hadn't meant to open. A subdirectory labeled simply Agricultural Holdings, buried 3 layers deep inside what she'd assumed was purely Vanguard-related legal correspondence. She almost closed it. It wasn't relevant to the sabotage trail, but a name in the file list caught her eye before she could look away. Vance, Peloponnese Grove, Subsidy Agreement. Her stomach dropped. "Kaelen." Her voice came out strange, tighter than she meant it to. "What is this?" He leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen, and for the first time since she'd met him, she watched something like discomfort cross his face. Not guilt, exactly, but the particular unease of a private thing suddenly exposed to light. "That's not related to the audit," he said. "That's my family's grove." She opened the file before he could stop her, scanning through pages of financial records, quiet transfers, routed through a holding company with no obvious connection to Kaelen Cross, keeping her grandfather's failing olive grove afloat for the past 4 years through below-market loans and silent debt forgiveness, structured so carefully that no one, not even a forensic auditor as good as Thalia, would have traced it back to a single source without direct access to his private servers. "This says a holding company under your control has been subsidizing us since before I ever set foot in your chateau, before I ever knew your name." "Yes," Kaelen said simply. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the sharp control she'd grown used to over the past day, replaced by something more careful, almost weary. "Because your grove isn't the only one. There are 211 small farms across southern Europe currently protected by the same network. Olive groves, vineyards, family orchards, all of them one bad season or one predatory buyout away from disappearing into a corporate portfolio where they'd be stripped for land value and forgotten." He gestured vaguely toward the folder still open on the screen. "I started it 11 years ago, after Vanguard, after Beatrice's company successfully forced 3 generations off a citrus farm in Sicily to build a distribution warehouse. I couldn't stop that one, so I decided I'd stop the next 100 instead." Thalia stared at him, the pieces rearranging themselves in her mind faster than she could hold on to them. The feared syndicate chief, the man whose name made people lower their voices. The same man who had, without ever mentioning it, been quietly keeping her family's land alive for years while she scraped together audit fees trying to do the same thing through spreadsheets and contract law. "You could have told me," she said. "On the plane, when I told you about the buyer circling my grandfather's land, you could have said something." "Would you have believed me?" he asked. "Or would you have assumed it was a tactic, a way to buy your loyalty before I needed it for something bigger?" She didn't have a ready answer for that, and the honesty of her own silence unsettled her. "I don't do this for gratitude," Kaelen continued. "Most of the families never know where the money comes from. It's cleaner that way, safer for them and for me." He looked at the screen again, at her family's name printed in cold, financial language. "I didn't plan for you to find this. I'm not sure I would have told you, even now, if you hadn't stumbled onto it yourself." Thalia sat back slowly, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not suspicion, exactly, though a careful, guarded part of her still expected a catch somewhere in this. But underneath that, something warmer and far more dangerous. The growing, unwelcome realization that the cold, calculating man she'd been sent to audit had been quietly protecting the thing she loved most in the world, long before he had any reason to. "There's a version of you the world doesn't get to see," she said quietly. "There's a version of everyone the world doesn't get to see," Kaelen replied. "You're just the first person in a long time who's bothered to look." Outside, the canal water lapped gently against the stone embankment, and somewhere across the city, Beatrice's people were still searching for the container that had already slipped past them, while inside the small safe house, something far more fragile than a shipment of rare wine had quietly begun to change hands. By 9 that evening, the safe house felt too small for what needed to happen next. "The backup shipment," Kaelen said, pacing in front of the window, curtains still drawn tight. 12 containers, uncompromised, stored in a separate section of the hub under a different manifest number. "If Beatrice's people haven't found them yet, we move them tonight, before she realizes her sabotage failed." Thalia was already packing her equipment away. "And if they have found them?" "Then we'll know very quickly," he said grimly, "because they won't let us leave with them quietly." He wasn't wrong. They reached the port just after dusk, the sky bruised purple over the water, cranes silhouetted like giant skeletal birds against the last light. Kaelen's small convoy, 3 unmarked trucks and a lead car, rolled toward the secondary storage yard where the backup shipment waited, and for the first 15 minutes, everything went according to plan. The containers were intact, seals unbroken, temperature logs clean. Thalia rode in the lead car beside Kaelen, laptop open on her knees, monitoring the port's public traffic feeds for anything unusual. Then the feeds went dark. "That's not a glitch," she said sharply, watching 3 separate camera streams cut to static within seconds of each other. "Someone's jamming the local signal." Kaelen was already reaching for the radio. "Odette, status on the exit routes." Static answered him too, for a beat too long before her voice cut through, tight and urgent. "Kaelen, the north and east gates are blocked. Vehicles, at least 8, positioned since we left the safe house. I think they were waiting for you to move the shipment." "They knew," Thalia said, the realization landing cold in her stomach. "They knew we'd come for the backup cargo tonight." "Which means the informant is still feeding them information in real time," Kaelen said, his jaw tightening. "Even now." Through the windshield, Thalia watched the convoy's lead truck slow, then stop. Ahead, where the exit road narrowed between 2 towering rows of stacked containers, a line of black SUVs had pulled across the width of the lane, blocking passage entirely. Men stepped out of them, unhurried, deliberate, the kind of calm that came from knowing they held the advantage. "Beatrice's people?" Thalia asked. "Contractors, more likely. She wouldn't dirty her own hands with something this direct." Kaelen's voice had dropped into something flat and dangerous, all the warmth from the safe house gone. "Stay in the car." "Kaelen, stay in the car," he repeated, "and open your laptop. I need the secondary cargo lane map, the automated route the port uses for driverless freight transfer. It's not on any public system, but it should be in the files Odette gave you this afternoon." Thalia understood immediately, while Kaelen stepped out to face the blockade directly, buying time with nothing but presence and reputation. She needed to find another way out, a route the mercenaries wouldn't be watching, because it wasn't a route built for human drivers. Her fingers moved fast over the keyboard, pulling up the layered schematic Odette had sent, a maze of automated lanes used by the port's driverless cargo shuttles to move containers between terminals without human intervention. If she could reroute the convoy's trucks onto that same network, even temporarily, they could bypass the blockade entirely. Outside, Kaelen had stepped forward alone, hands loose at his sides, addressing the line of armed men with the unbothered calm of someone discussing shipping schedules rather than his own life. "You're on my leased section of this port," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "I'd think carefully about what happens next." One of the men, broader than the rest, clearly in charge, stepped forward with a thin smile. "Miss Cross sends her regards. She'd like her brother to reconsider his plans for tonight." "Tell my sister," Kaelen said, "that I don't take instructions delivered by men in rented suits." Thalia, half listening, found what she needed, a maintenance access route, 3 lanes over, normally reserved for automated shuttle traffic, currently flagged inactive for the night shift. It wasn't guarded because no one expected trucks to use it. It wasn't monitored because the cameras covering it fed into the same system Beatrice's people had already jammed. "Kaelen," she said through the radio, keeping her voice low and steady. "Lane C7, maintenance access. It's inactive, unguarded, runs parallel to the blockade and comes out near the cargo plane hangar. I can override the shuttle lockout remotely if your drivers can get the trucks positioned." There was the briefest pause before his voice came back, quieter now, meant only for her. "Do it." What followed happened fast, faster than Thalia had time to be afraid. She overrode the shuttle lockout from her laptop while Kaelen kept the mercenaries occupied with a conversation that gave nothing away and conceded nothing either, buying precious minutes with nothing but nerve. The convoy's drivers, following Odette's relayed instructions, peeled off one by one into the narrow maintenance lane, engines quiet, headlights off, moving like ghosts through a route no one was watching. By the time Beatrice's men realized the trucks weren't where they should be, the convoy was already 3 lanes away, threading toward the private hangar where a cargo plane sat waiting, engines warming. Kaelen backed away from the blockade slowly, unhurried, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a retreat that looked like fear, and slid back into the car just as the last truck cleared the hangar doors. "Go," he told the driver, and the car pulled away smoothly, leaving the mercenaries standing confused and empty-handed in the glow of their own headlights. Inside the car, the adrenaline finally caught up with Thalia, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the laptop. Kaelen noticed, and for a moment his hand covered hers, brief, steadying, gone before she could fully register it. "You just outmaneuvered my sister's private security without raising your voice once," he said, something like admiration threading through the words. "You're the one who stood in front of 8 armed men and talked like you were bored," Thalia said, breathless. "I just found the map." "Maps don't win fights," Kaelen said quietly, watching the port lights shrink behind them as the car sped toward the hangar. "People who know how to read them do." Behind them, the last of the uncorrupted shipment rolled onto the waiting cargo plane, engines roaring to life, bound for a coastline neither of them had mentioned yet aloud, though Thalia already knew, with a certainty that settled somewhere deep and unfamiliar in her chest, exactly whose home they were flying toward. The plane touched down just before dawn, and Thalia felt the shift the moment the cargo doors opened. Warm air instead of North Sea cold, the smell of dry earth and salt instead of diesel, cicadas already starting their slow hum in the grey early light. Home. Or close enough to it that her chest tightened at the sight of the hills. "We're 20 minutes from your family's grove," Kaelen said, standing beside her on the tarmac, watching her study the horizon like she was memorizing it. "I thought you'd want to know that before we go anywhere else." "You planned the landing site around my grandfather's land," she said. It wasn't a question. "I planned it around the estate in Kalamata, where the signing will happen tonight," he said. The grove being close was not entirely a coincidence. 36 hours ago, she would have called that manipulation. Now, Standing on a runway with the sun just beginning to climb over the Peloponnese, she found she didn't have the energy to be suspicious of kindness anymore. She was too tired, too far from home, and somehow closer to it than she'd been in months, and too aware of the man beside her in a way that had nothing to do with audits or sabotage. They drove to the operational base, a modest cliffside villa Kaelen's people had secured weeks earlier for exactly this kind of contingency. All whitewashed stone and blue shutters overlooking a sea so bright it looked unreal. Odette had already arrived ahead of them, setting up secure communications in what had once clearly been a family dining room, papers and screens spread across a long wooden table that still smelled faintly of lemon oil. "The consortium arrives at the Kalamata estate at 11 tonight," Odette reported, not looking up from her tablet. "Security's confirmed. The signing room is ready. We have roughly 14 hours. "Then we sleep in shifts," Kaelen said, "starting with Ms. Vance." "I'm not tired," Thalia lied. "You've been awake for over 20 hours, outrun armed men, and hacked a shipping company's private network," Kaelen said, the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You're tired. You're just too stubborn to admit it." She didn't have a good argument against that, so she let Odette show her to a small room upstairs and slept harder and more completely than she had in months, waking in the late afternoon to golden light slanting through the shutters and the distant sound of waves against rock. She found Kaelen alone on the terrace, sleeves rolled up again, staring out at the water with a stillness that felt different from his usual controlled calm, something closer to exhaustion, or maybe memory. "You should be resting too," she said, joining him at the railing. "I don't sleep well before deals like this," he admitted. "Too many ways for it to go wrong." Below them, past the cliff edge, the coastline curved toward a patchwork of green, olive terraces, she realized, close enough that she could almost place which grove belonged to which family, a skill she'd learned as a child and never quite lost. "That's yours, isn't it?" Kaelen said, following her gaze. "The Vance Grove. Third terrace from the shoreline. You can see the old stone wall my great-grandfather built if you know where to look." She felt the pull of it, even from this distance, familiar and aching. "I haven't been back in almost a year. I kept telling myself I was too busy. The truth is, I didn't want to see how close it was to being lost." "It won't be lost," Kaelen said. "Not now." "You keep saying things like that so easily, like the world just bends because you've decided something." "In my world, it usually does." He turned to face her fully, and something in his posture had softened, the sharp control from Rotterdam replaced by an openness she hadn't seen from him before. "You asked me once why I hired you specifically, out of every auditor in Europe. I gave you a business answer on the plane. That wasn't the whole truth." Thalia's pulse quickened. "What's the whole truth?" "Your reputation isn't just for competence," he said. "It's for integrity that can't be bought. I've spent 11 years building a network to protect farms like yours, and in all that time, I have never once trusted anyone outside my closest circle with the full truth of what I was doing. Because the moment someone with real influence knew, they'd either try to use it against me or try to buy their way into controlling it." He held her gaze steadily. "I needed an audit no one could accuse of being paid off by my sister. I needed someone whose name alone would make the consortium believe the results, no matter what I stood to gain or lose. That's the business reason." His voice dropped, quieter now, almost reluctant. "The other reason is that I read about a woman who spent years trying to save a small family grove, using nothing but stubbornness and a law degree, and I wanted to meet her before I ever had a reason to hire her." The last of the sun was slipping toward the sea, painting the water in long streaks of amber and rose, and Thalia stood very still, aware of how close he was, aware of 36 hours that had somehow rearranged everything she thought she understood about danger and safety and the kind of man worth trusting. "That's a dangerous thing to admit to your auditor," she said softly, "the night before the biggest deal of your career." "Most things worth having are dangerous to admit," Kaelen said. "I decided a long time ago that didn't mean they shouldn't be said." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything neither had said aloud until now. Not quite a confession, not quite a promise, but something unmistakably shifting beneath the surface of two people who had started as strangers with a business arrangement and were quickly becoming something far harder to name. Then Odette's voice broke through from inside, calling Kaelen's name with an urgency that cut the moment cleanly in half. "Kaelen, you need to see this. Beatrice just sent something to Thalia's phone." Thalia's phone was already buzzing when she reached the dining room, an encrypted message notification blinking on a screen she didn't recognize as her own, a secure app Odette must have installed while she slept, forwarding anything flagged as high priority. "Open it," Kaelen said, standing close behind her shoulder, his earlier softness gone, replaced entirely by the controlled tension of a man bracing for impact. Thalia opened the message. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just a photograph first, an old newspaper clipping, 5 years out of date, showing a much younger Thalia standing outside a regional courthouse in Athens, her name printed clearly in the caption. "Whistleblower auditor exposes fraud at Meridian Agri-Exports." Beneath it, a second image, a fabricated internal memo dated last month, bearing a forged version of her signature, describing supposed corporate espionage against a logistics firm that, until Rotterdam, Thalia had never even heard of. Then the message itself. "You have good instincts, Ms. Vance, I respect that, which is why I'll make this simple. I know about your family's grove, and I know about the buyer currently circling it. A buyer, I should mention, who works for me. I also know that 5 years ago, you built your entire career on being the woman who couldn't be bought. It would be a shame if that reputation quietly reversed itself tonight. Replace my brother's final audit report with the failure document attached below before the consortium arrives. Confirm the spoilage as unresolved. Do this quietly, and your family keeps their land, and your name stays clean. Refuse, and by morning, 3 financial journalists will have this forged memo. Your grandfather will have a foreclosure notice, and Kaelen will have learned exactly how easily his prized, incorruptible auditor folded under pressure. You have 4 hours. B." Thalia read it twice, then a third time, feeling something cold and precise settle over her. Not panic, not yet, but the sharp, focused clarity she recognized from every audit she'd ever conducted under pressure. She set the phone down on the table, very deliberately, and looked up to find Kaelen watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You went quiet," he said carefully. "Tell me what she said." "She's threatening to destroy my reputation with a forged memo, foreclose on my family's grove through a buyer she controls, and expose it all to journalists," Thalia said, keeping her voice level, even as her hands weren't entirely steady. "Unless I replace your final audit with a falsified failure report before the consortium arrives tonight." The room went very still. Odette, who had been standing near the window, stopped typing entirely. Kaelen didn't move for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting would have. "Show me." Thalia handed him the phone without hesitation and watched his face as he read it. Watched the muscle in his jaw tighten with each line, watched something old and furious surface behind his eyes as he reached the part about her grandfather's land. "She's using the same lever twice," he said finally, handing the phone back. "The grove, and now your reputation. She's not being creative, she's being desperate." "Desperate people still win, if they're desperate enough," Thalia said. "Kaelen, I need you to hear something clearly right now before you say anything else. I am not going to falsify that audit. Whatever she threatens, whatever it costs me, I built my entire career on the fact that my reports can't be bought. If I fold the first time someone applies real pressure, then everything I've ever done means nothing. And so does your trust in hiring me for exactly that reason." "I know," Kaelen said simply. "I never doubted that for a second." "Then why do you look like you're bracing for me to say otherwise?" He exhaled slowly, some of the sharp control cracking at the edges. "Because I know what it costs to refuse someone like Beatrice. I've watched her destroy people who called her bluff before. Good people. People who didn't deserve what happened to them. I don't want that to be you, not because of a deal I built." "This isn't only about your deal anymore," Thalia said. She threatened my family. That makes it mine, too. Something shifted in Kaelen's expression at that. Not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a man realizing he wasn't facing this alone anymore. Then we don't give her what she wants, he said. We give her what she thinks she wants. Thalia felt the shape of an idea beginning to form, the same instinct that had caught the temperature discrepancy back in Bordeaux, now turning itself toward a different kind of trap. You mean feed her false confirmation? Let her believe the sabotage worked, let her believe I folded, and use that false confidence against her. Beatrice built her entire plan on the assumption that pressure works, Kaelen said, something sharp and almost eager entering his voice now, the first real spark of strategy replacing fury. If we hand her exactly the confirmation she's demanding, a convincing one, she won't suspect a trap. She'll walk into that signing tonight believing she's already won. And when she realizes she hasn't, Thalia said, she'll be standing in front of the consortium, in front of witnesses, with no way to explain how she knew the shipment had failed, unless she admits to sabotaging it herself. Odette, still by the window, finally spoke, her voice quiet but certain. It's a good plan, but it's also a 4-hour window to build a forgery good enough to fool someone who builds forgeries for a living. Thalia was already pulling her laptop toward her, mind moving fast, the exhaustion from 20 minutes ago entirely gone, replaced by the particular clean focus she felt whenever a problem finally had a shape she could work with. Then we'd better start now, she said, because Beatrice just made the mistake of thinking I'm the kind of person who breaks under a deadline. Kaelen watched her for a moment, something fierce and unmistakably proud settling into his expression, before he pulled a chair up beside her and reached for his own laptop. Tell me what you need, he said. We build this together. They moved the operation to the old olive mill on the edge of the estate grounds, a stone building with thick walls and a satellite dish Odette had quietly installed weeks earlier as part of Kaelen's contingency planning, giving them a private network no one outside the estate could trace. We can't just send Beatrice a fake report, Thalia said, pulling up a blank document and staring at it like an opponent. She built the sabotage plan. She'll expect the failure data to match the exact chemical signature of the tampering she used, the specific spike pattern, the specific spoilage markers. If we fabricate something generic, she'll know immediately. So use the real data, Kaelen said. The compromised shipment, the one still sitting in the Bordeaux vault. Thalia looked up sharply. You want me to build the bait file using the actual spoiled wine's readings? She sabotaged 3 shipments, Kaelen said. We only rescued 1. The other 2 are genuinely compromised, genuinely ruined, exactly the way she intended. If your report shows those real numbers and simply implies they represent the entire shipment, not just the 2 containers she managed to reach, it isn't a lie. It's an incomplete truth. And incomplete truths are far harder to detect than fabricated ones. Thalia sat back, turning the idea over with the same careful scrutiny she gave every audit. It was elegant, she had to admit, using Beatrice's own sabotage as the foundation for the trap that would expose her. It also means the file will pass any technical verification her people run on it, because the data is real, just presented without the context that would clear you. Exactly. There's still a problem, Odette cut in from across the mill, where she'd been monitoring Vanguard's network traffic on a secondary screen. Beatrice isn't going to trust a report that arrives cleanly through official channels. She expects Thalia to have compromised the process quietly, under pressure, which means the file needs to look like it was extracted, not delivered, rushed, a little imperfect. Thalia almost smiled at that. You want me to make it look like I panicked? I want it to look like integrity finally cracked, Odette said. Beatrice needs to believe she broke something rare. That's what will pull her out of hiding and get her standing in that room tonight, instead of watching from a safe distance. It took nearly 2 hours to build the file properly, pulling the genuine spoilage data from the 2 ruined containers, formatting it to look like an internal draft rather than a polished final report, complete with a scrawled note in the margin, in Thalia's own handwriting, photographed and embedded into the document, reading simply, "Can't confirm total scope before deadline. Recommend disclosure withheld pending further review. Ambiguous enough to look like a compromised professional cutting corners under pressure. Convincing enough that no one who didn't already know the truth would question it. Now the delivery, Kaelen said, watching Thalia work with something like admiration threading through his focus. It needs to come from a channel Beatrice believes is secure and untraceable back to us. The olive mill's local network can route through a relay registered to a shipping cooperative 3 villages over, Odette offered. Beatrice's people won't think to check a small Greek agricultural network for a corporate leak. It's too far beneath her radar. Thalia cued the file, hands hovering over the keyboard, feeling the full weight of what she was about to send. Not just a piece of digital bait, but the last 4 hours of her deadline, compressed into a single, carefully constructed lie of omission. Once this goes out, she said, there's no walking it back. If she doesn't take the bait exactly the way we expect, we'll have handed her real, damaging data with no way to retrieve it. She'll take it, Kaelen said quietly. Beatrice has spent her entire career assuming everyone eventually breaks. She wants this to be true more than she wants to verify it carefully. That's her weakness. She trusts her own certainty more than she trusts caution. Thalia thought of the message on her phone. I know you couldn't be bought, which is why I'll make this simple, and understood, with sudden clarity, that Kaelen was right. Beatrice hadn't built a careful trap. She'd built a threat designed for someone she assumed would panic, and panic people made mistakes that confident people could exploit. She sent the file. The reply came faster than any of them expected. 11 minutes later, a short, satisfied message from an unknown number, Odette immediately flagged as connected to Beatrice's personal line. Smart go. I'll see you both tonight, -B. She's coming herself, Kaelen said, reading over Thalia's shoulder, something grim and focused settling into his expression. Not sending representatives. She wants to watch this happen in person. That's what we needed, Thalia said, though her pulse hadn't slowed since sending the file. She has to be standing in that room when the real audit surfaces, or the trap means nothing. Kaelen turned to face her fully, and for a moment the strategy fell away entirely, replaced by something quieter and more direct. You just handed my sister exactly enough rope to hang herself with, using nothing but real data and a handwriting sample, in under 4 hours, while under direct threat to your family and your name. He shook his head slowly, something between disbelief and pride in his expression. I've had people on my payroll for a decade who couldn't have executed that. I had good motivation, Thalia said, and a very sharp partner. Partner, Kaelen repeated, testing the word like it fit differently than he expected it to. Odette, watching the exchange with poorly concealed amusement, cleared her throat pointedly. The consortium arrives in 5 hours. I'd suggest the partners in question get some food and a change of clothes before the real performance begins. Outside the mill's thick stone walls, the sun had begun its slow slide toward the sea, the light turning the olive terraces below into rippling silver green, and somewhere across the water, Beatrice was already making her way toward a trap she believed was a victory, while inside, Thalia felt the last of her fear settle into something steadier, sharper, and entirely ready for midnight. The Kalamata estate glowed like something out of a different century by the time the guests began arriving, torches lining the cliffside path, long tables set beneath strings of warm light, the sound of the sea a constant murmur beneath the low hum of conversation. Thalia stood near the edge of the terrace in a borrowed dress Odette had produced from somewhere, watching the East Asian delegation move through the courtyard with the careful, measured politeness of people about to sign away millions of dollars, and felt her pulse climb steadily toward whatever came next. You look like you're about to walk into a courtroom, not a party, Kaelen said quietly, appearing at her side in a dark suit that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, less like a dangerous businessman and more like a man bracing himself for something personal. I am walking into a courtroom, Thalia said. It just doesn't have walls yet. At exactly 11, the delegation's lead negotiator, a composed woman named Director Han, greeted Kaelen with formal warmth, her assistants trailing behind her with tablets and folders, ready for the final review before signatures were exchanged. Thalia recognized the particular tension in the air of people who had already heard rumors, vague, unconfirmed whispers about spoiled shipments and quality concerns, and were watching Kaelen closely for any crack in his composure. He gave them none. At 11:15, Beatrice arrived. She came alone, which surprised Thalia more than an entourage would have. No security detail, no lawyers, just a tall, elegant woman in ice-blue silk who moved through the crowd like she already owned the room, a faint, satisfied smile playing at the corner of her mouth as her eyes found Thalia across the terrace.
"Miss Vance,"
Beatrice said, drifting close enough to speak privately, her voice pleasant, almost warm. "I have to say, I underestimated you. Most people take longer than 4 hours to understand which side of a deal actually protects them." "I understand exactly which side protects me," Thalia said evenly. "I don't think you do." Something flickered across Beatrice's face, brief, easily dismissed as confidence, before she moved on toward the small cluster forming around Director Han, positioning herself with the practiced ease of someone about to deliver devastating news wrapped in professional concern. "Director Han," Beatrice said, once introductions had settled and the terrace had quieted into the low murmur of people sensing a shift. "Before you finalize anything tonight, I think you deserve to know something my brother would rather you didn't." The courtyard stilled. Kaelen said nothing, his expression carefully neutral, letting her walk forward into the space they'd built for her. "I have reason to believe," Beatrice continued, producing a tablet from her clutch with theatrical precision, "that the shipment currently docked in this region, the shipment your consortium is about to build a multi-million-dollar partnership around, has suffered significant, undisclosed spoilage. I have documentation suggesting my brother's own audit team was aware of this and chose to conceal it rather than risk losing this contract." She turned the tablet toward Director Han, displaying the bait file exactly as it had been sent, real spoilage data, a scrawled, handwritten note, everything engineered to look like a buried truth finally surfacing. Director Han's expression turned cold. "Mr. Cross, is this accurate?" The silence stretched for 2 full seconds, long enough that Thalia felt her own heartbeat in her throat, long enough that she understood exactly how much rested on the next few moments. Then she stepped forward. "It's partially accurate," Thalia said, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. "And I'd like to explain the part Ms. Cross left out." She held up her own tablet, already prepared, already synced to the live laboratory feed Adet had set up from the Port Authority's testing facility. Real-time footage of the 12 rescued containers, seals verified, chemical readings displayed in clean, current data, streaming directly from instruments no one in this courtyard could fake. 3 nights ago, someone accessed a refrigerated storage unit at the Rotterdam Transit Hub and deliberately compromised 2 containers of Mr. Cross's shipment, Thalia said. "The data on Ms. Cross's tablet is real. It belongs to those 2 containers, the ones sabotaged through a custom-engineered bypass device manufactured by Vanguard Logistics." She let that settle, watching Beatrice's composed expression falter for the first time. What she didn't show you is that 12 additional containers, entirely uncompromised, were secured and flown here under Mr. Cross's direct protection, specifically because we discovered the tampering in time. You're looking at those containers, live, on this screen, right now. Director Han's gaze moved slowly from the screen to Beatrice, whose confident smile had gone brittle at the edges. "That's absurd," Beatrice said, too quickly. "Fabricated footage proves nothing." "The bypass device is currently in the possession of Rotterdam Port authorities," Kaelen said, finally stepping forward, his voice low and unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who had waited a long time to say this exact sentence. "It carries a manufacturer's stamp registered to Vanguard Logistics, along with an authorization code traced to internal access only your executive team can grant. My legal counsel filed a formal report with Dutch maritime authorities 4 hours ago." The color drained slowly from Beatrice's face. "You sabotaged your own brother's shipment," Director Han said slowly, each word deliberate, "to force a corporate merger." "That's not," Beatrice started, but there was nowhere left for the sentence to go. No version of the truth that survived contact with real-time footage, forensic hardware, and a filed maritime report all converging in the same breath. "The message you sent me 4 hours ago threatening my family and my reputation is still on my phone, Ms. Cross," Thalia added quietly, watching something in Beatrice finally crack. Not remorse, but the particular fury of someone realizing they'd been outmaneuvered by exactly the person they'd underestimated. "I'd be happy to share that too, if the consortium's legal team would find it useful." For a long, suspended moment, no one on the terrace moved. The torches flickered against the dark water below, the sea hushing quietly against the rocks, and Beatrice Cross stood exposed in front of witnesses she couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't outmaneuver. While beside her, the brother she'd spent a decade trying to destroy watched with an expression that held no triumph at all. Only the tired, aching relief of a truth finally allowed to surface. For a moment, Beatrice tried one more angle. "This is a coordinated smear," she said, turning to Director Hahn with the last of her composure gathered around her like armor. "My brother has always resented my company's success. This entire evening has clearly been staged to—" "Ms. Cross." Director Hahn's voice cut through cleanly, without heat, which somehow made it more final than shouting would have. "I have spent 30 years building trade partnerships across 3 continents. I know the difference between a staged accusation and forensic evidence with a filed maritime report attached to it. What I am looking at is the latter." She turned to one of her assistants. "Contact our legal team. I want to know immediately whether Vanguard Logistics has any existing agreements with our consortium that need to be reviewed in light of this." The words landed on Beatrice like a physical blow. Thalia watched her hands tighten around the tablet, still displaying the bait file. The very evidence she'd brought to destroy her brother, now sitting useless in her grip, its purpose entirely reversed. Then, Beatrice's phone began to buzz. Once, twice, a third time in rapid succession, and something in her expression shifted from fury into something colder and more frightened as she glanced at the screen. "That will be your board," Kaelen said quietly, watching her reaction with no satisfaction in his voice, only a kind of weary certainty. "I imagine Odette's report reached them roughly the same moment it reached Dutch maritime authorities. Vanguard's shareholders tend to move quickly when criminal sabotage and international fraud threaten a filed government complaint." "You had this planned from the moment we sent that file," Beatrice said, staring at him. "I had this planned from the moment you attached a bypass device to my cooling unit, with your company's manufacturing stamp still on it," Kaelen said. "Everything after that was just waiting for you to walk into the room yourself." Beatrice's phone rang again, and this time she answered it, stepping away from the gathered crowd with her shoulders rigid, her voice dropping into the clipped, controlled tone Thalia imagined she used when negotiating deals she still believed she was winning. It didn't last. Within minutes, whatever the voice on the other end told her drained the last of the fight from her posture entirely. When she returned, she was a different woman. Smaller, somehow, despite the ice-blue silk and the composed features she was visibly working to hold together. "The board has voted to suspend my executive authority pending a full investigation," she said flatly, addressing no one and everyone at once. "Effective immediately." "To avoid criminal liability falling on the company as a whole," Kaelen said. It wasn't a question. "They're distancing themselves from me before the story breaks," Beatrice said. "Which it will. Within the hour, I imagine, given how thoroughly documented this evening apparently was." She looked at Thalia then, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest a woman like Beatrice Cross ever came to acknowledging she'd lost. "You're better than your reputation suggested, Ms. Vance. I underestimated exactly how far integrity could be weaponized against someone who's never had to rely on it." "Integrity isn't a weapon," Thalia said. "It's just the truth, told to people who'd rather it stayed hidden." Beatrice didn't respond to that. She simply turned, and with the last of her composure gathered tightly around her, walked back through the courtyard and down the torchlit path toward the waiting cars. Alone. The way she'd arrived, except now Every eye on the terrace followed her exit, and every conversation that would happen in boardrooms across Europe over the following weeks would carry her name attached to failure instead of ambition. The silence that followed her departure lasted only a moment before Director Han turned back to Kaelen, her expression settling into something businesslike and, for the first time all evening, genuinely warm. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I believe we have a contract to finalize, assuming, of course, your audit team can provide final documentation confirming the integrity of the shipment we'll actually be receiving." "Ms. Vance," Kaelen said, turning to Thalia with something that looked almost like relief breaking through his careful control. "Would you do the honors?" Thalia pulled the real audit report from her tablet, the true one, complete and unaltered, showing the 12 rescued containers in full, verified detail, alongside a clear account of the sabotage, its source, and the security measures now in place to prevent any repeat. She handed it to Director Han's assistant with the quiet satisfaction of a job finished exactly the way it should have been from the start. "Everything here is verified against live laboratory data, chain of custody documentation, and forensic evidence recovered from the compromised units," Thalia said. "You're not just getting a supplier tonight, Director Han. You're getting one who caught the sabotage, traced it, and stopped it before it ever touched your shipment." Director Han studied the report for a long moment, then looked up at Kaelen with something like genuine respect. "Most men in your position would have hidden this entirely and hoped we never found out. Most men in my position built their reputation on being untouchable," Kaelen said. "I decided a long time ago I'd rather build mine on being trustworthy instead. Tonight simply proved which one actually holds up under pressure." The signing happened quietly after that, almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Pens, signatures, the quiet click of a deal finally sealed at 11:58 p.m., 4 minutes before the deadline that had shaped every frantic hour of the past 3 days. Applause rippled softly across the terrace, champagne glasses lifted, the tension that had gripped the estate all evening finally beginning to dissolve into something lighter. Thalia stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching Kaelen accept congratulations with the same measured calm he'd carried since Bordeaux, and felt the full weight of the last 3 days finally settle over her. The sabotage, the sacrifice, the sister who'd tried to destroy everything he'd built, the family grove that would now, impossibly, be safe. He caught her eye across the terrace, and for a moment, everything else in the courtyard seemed to fall away entirely. Midnight had come and gone. The contract that started this all was signed. Her one evening had ended 3 days ago, and somehow, she found she had absolutely no desire to leave. The celebration thinned slowly, guests drifting toward cars and the estate's guest rooms, Director Han's delegation departing with warm handshakes and promises of a long partnership ahead. By the time the terrace emptied, it was well past midnight, and only the torches remained lit, burning low against the dark water below. Kaelen found Thalia exactly where she'd drifted after the signing, the far edge of the terrace, overlooking the cliff, close enough to hear the sea, but far enough from the noise to finally breathe. "You disappeared," he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. "I needed a minute," Thalia said. 3 days is a lot to process in one exhale." 3 days, he repeated, something wry in his voice. "You were hired for 1 evening." "I remember." She glanced at him sideways. "You were very insistent about that, back in the cellar. 1 evening, 1 report, 1 fee." "I was wrong about the fee," Kaelen said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, handing it to her without ceremony. "That's the correct compensation for tonight's work." Thalia unfolded it, expecting a wire transfer confirmation or an inflated invoice, something businesslike, something that matched the transactional tone he'd used at their very first meeting. Instead, she found a legal transfer document, her family's name printed clearly at the top, every outstanding debt on her grandfather's olive grove marked "paid in full," and beneath it, full title of the land transferred back into her family's name, free of any lien, any subsidy trail, any silent dependency on Kaelen's holding companies. Her hands went still.
"Kaelen, this is yours," he said simply. "Free and clear. No hidden strings, no quiet debt owed to me for the rest of your life. I had my lawyers finalize it 3 hours ago, once it was clear the deal with Director Han would close." He watched her carefully, some of his usual composure slipping into something more uncertain. "I wanted you to have it regardless of how tonight ended. You earned it the moment you found that temperature discrepancy in my cellar, whether or not you'd agreed to come to Rotterdam." Thalia stared down at the document, at 4 generations of her family's history finally, permanently secured, and felt something break open in her chest that she'd been holding too tightly for far too long. Not just relief, but grief for how close they'd come to losing it, and gratitude so large it left her briefly unable to speak. "Thank you," she finally managed. "Isn't a big enough sentence for this."
"It doesn't need to be big," Kaelen said quietly. "It just needs to be true." She folded the document carefully, holding it against her chest for a moment before setting it on the railing, needing both hands free for what she wanted to say next, though she wasn't entirely sure yet what that was. "My contract ended at midnight," she said instead. "Officially. One evening, extended by 3 days of sabotage, betrayal, and international fraud. But technically, it's over now." "Technically," Kaelen agreed. "So I suppose this is the part where I go home." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that reminded her of the very first night, in the cellar, when he'd watched her work like he was trying to memorize something he didn't yet have a name for. "I don't want you to go home," he said finally, the words coming out rougher than his usual careful control allowed. "I've spent 11 years building something I believed mattered more than anything else. Protecting land, protecting people, keeping a version of the world alive that corporations like Vanguard would happily pave over for profit. I did it alone because I didn't trust anyone enough to let them see the parts of me that weren't calculated or controlled." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and something far warmer beneath it in his eyes. "Then you walked into my cellar 3 days ago and found a truth I didn't even know I was hiding from myself. That all of it, the empire, the reputation, the fear people have when they hear my name means very little if there's no one I trust enough to actually share it with." Thalia's breath caught. "Kaelen." "I'm not asking you to be my auditor anymore," he said. "I'm asking you to stay. Not as someone hired for an evening or a week or a project with an end date, as my equal, head of ethical sourcing across the entire network, the farms, the groves, the families we've been quietly protecting for over a decade. Work that matters to you as much as it matters to me, built by both of us instead of hidden by one." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something unguarded and entirely honest. "And beyond the work, I'm asking you to stay because these 3 days were the first time in longer than I can remember that I wanted someone beside me who wasn't there because I was paying them or because they feared me, but because they chose to be." The sea moved quietly below them, the torches burning low, the whole coast stretched out dark and glittering toward a horizon neither of them could see clearly yet. Thalia thought of the frightened, exhausted woman who'd walked into a stranger's cellar 3 nights ago, expecting one report and one fee, and the version of herself standing here now, changed by sabotage and blackmail, and a courage she hadn't fully known she possessed. And by a man who'd turned out to be nothing like his reputation and everything like the kind of partner she hadn't let herself imagine wanting. "I came here to save your business," she said softly. "I didn't expect to find someone worth staying for." "Is that a yes?" Thalia stepped closer, closing the last of the distance between them, and felt the answer settle into place with a certainty that surprised her with how simple it actually was. "That's a yes," she said. Kaelen Cross, feared syndicate chief, protector of forgotten farms, a man the world had learned to fear long before it learned to trust him, reached for her hand on the moonlit terrace, and for the first time since she'd met him, let himself smile without any calculation behind it at all. Behind them, the torches burned low toward morning, and somewhere far below, the olive terraces of the Peloponnese stood quiet and safe in the dark, finally, permanently, home.